It began with a dramatic police raid that made headlines at 5 p.m. last night. Today, the public is learning why state police stormed the Messer Street clubhouse. Local police didn't intervene, not out of neglect, but because in small California towns like Barstow and Fontana, they're simply outnumbered and outgunned. What happened in these towns during the late 1960s wasn't just a crime wave. It was a hostile takeover. What were once quiet desert communities turned into strongholds for one of the world's most feared outlaw motorcycle clubs, the Hells Angels. Streets fell silent when their engines roared. Even experienced officers admitted they couldn't keep up. The Hells Angels weren't just a motorcycle club anymore. They had become a well-armed organization that exerted fear and control over entire towns. The birth of an empire. Fontana, California, 1948. The Second World War had ended, leaving thousands of veterans searching for purpose, adrenaline, and brotherhood. In the sun-drenched streets of this working-class town, a few of them found it, on motorcycles. What began as a local riding group quickly changed. The Hells Angels became less about motorcycles and more about loyalty, territory, and intimidation. Fontana's open roads and limited police presence allowed the club to grow rapidly. By the 1960s, chapters had spread across California, San Bernardino, Oakland, Bakersfield, each one more dangerous and organized than the last. The Hells Angels didn't choose locations at random. They picked quiet highways, weak police departments, and vast rural areas that allowed them to expand with little resistance. They weren't just a group of men riding bikes, they were a network, and they were building an empire, planting the flag. Fontana was more than their birthplace. It became their command center. From there, towns like Barstow began to feel the pressure of their growing influence. Highways like I-10 and I-15 allowed for rapid movement, drug trafficking, and territorial control. In 1967, just outside Barstow in Alta Loma, police raided a property called the Gray Ranch. What they found shocked them. Weapons, drugs, and families living in makeshift conditions inside a fortified compound. This wasn't just a hangout. It was a full-blown headquarters. Neighbors were too terrified to speak out. The Angels didn't need politics to hold power. Fear was their currency. In towns like Barstow, with underfunded police departments and small forces, a single clubhouse could overwhelm local law enforcement. Officers often faced an entire chapter of men operating under their own code. The Bass Lake Invasions. In the early 1960s, the Hells Angels began staging high-profile public events. One of their most notorious gathering spots was Bass Lake, a peaceful mountain resort town in Madera County. Starting in 1963, they flooded the area during Memorial Day and July 4th weekends. Their presence turned the town into a battleground. Bars were destroyed. Fights broke out. Law enforcement, already stretched thin, had to call in help from other counties. In 1965, the situation grew so intense that local sheriffs erected roadblocks and sought legal action. The Hells Angels pushed back, and the confrontation drew national media attention. Major publications descended on the town to cover what looked like a biker siege of small-town America, a silent takeover. While the events at Bass Lake were loud and obvious, other towns like Barstow and Fontana experienced a slower, quieter invasion. By the late 1960s, law enforcement realized how deeply the Hells Angels had embedded themselves in local communities. The Gray Ranch raid revealed a fully operational outpost of criminal activity, stockpiles of drugs, weapons, stolen goods, and entire families loyal to the club. Complaints were rare, not because everything was fine, but because people feared retaliation. Even police officers hesitated to patrol near known properties. Some left the force altogether. In towns like Barstow, the system effectively collapsed. Residents stopped calling the police. Silence became the norm. An unofficial occupation By the early 1970s, the Hells Angels had gone beyond making appearances. They controlled homes, ran businesses, and built clubhouses that served as regional command centers. Locals saw bikers patrolling their streets as if they were the real law enforcement. Outsiders weren't welcome, and insiders didn't need to be told the rules. Planning a police raid took weeks, and by then, the club's internal network had often already been alerted. Surveillance was nearly impossible. The Angels operated with their own intelligence systems, and their counter-surveillance often worked better than official law enforcement methods. When fear became violence. Through the 1980s and 1990s, intimidation gave way to full-blown violence. Assaults, bar fights, and weapons charges exploded. Law enforcement could no longer ignore it. Police reports filled with evidence of organized crime, extortion rings, armed robberies, large-scale drug trafficking. This wasn't random chaos. It was coordinated, calculated, and protected by strict club hierarchy. The 2024 takedown. The turning point came in 2024 in Bakersfield, California. State, federal, and local agencies conducted one of the largest raids in recent history. This wasn't just about arresting a few individuals. It was a complete takedown of the entire local chapter. The president, vice president, and ranking members were all charged with violent felonies including kidnapping, robbery, and conspiracy. It marked the result of years of undercover work, surveillance, and intelligence gathering. Law enforcement didn't just disrupt operations. They dismantled the infrastructure. Law enforcement had finally gathered the evidence they needed. Undeniable proof that a local chapter of the Hells Angels was conducting violent criminal operations across the region. Raids led to the seizure of extensive collections of firearms, caches of stolen goods, and documents directly linking the chapter to larger multi-state criminal networks. But the Bakersfield bust was just one piece of a much broader campaign. In 2024, coordinated raids took place in cities like Stockton and Turlock, where authorities uncovered dozens of illegal weapons, high-capacity magazines suited for warfare, and stolen merchandise worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. In Sacramento, federal agents launched wide-ranging sweeps that resulted in multiple arrests and significant asset seizures. The message from authorities was clear. The era of passive tolerance was over. Yet these victories came at a steep cost. Undercover agents embedded within biker gangs like ATF Agent J. Dobbins in the early 2000s later revealed just how dangerous those operations truly were. Dobbins spent nearly 2 years posing as a member of an outlaw motorcycle gang, constantly under the threat of exposure and violent retaliation. His life was never safe, not even for a moment. Informants frequently withdrew out of fear, while others vanished altogether under mysterious circumstances. When raids were finally launched, law enforcement had to approach every building as a potential combat zone. The Hells Angels were not passive. They employed armed guards, lookout systems, and contingency plans to counter any raid. As federal indictments piled up, fractures began to form in the organization's armor. Some members turned informant, others fled to different states or even different countries. Certain chapters dissolved entirely, not out of remorse, but because staying meant almost certain arrest or worse. This is what a takeover looks like. When people hear that the Hells Angels took over a town, they often imagine explosive violence or cinematic shootouts. But the truth is far more disturbing. Calculated, silent, and insidious. Their approach doesn't involve storming City Hall. It's about strategic infiltration. They target towns that are geographically isolated, lightly policed, and linked to major highways. Then they move in, not as invaders, but as ordinary neighbors who just happen to ride motorcycles. The first step is establishing a base, usually a clubhouse. These aren't hidden. They are highly visible, often fortified with metal gates, surveillance systems, and concrete walls. Inside, the real work begins, organizing, disciplining, and executing operations. They don't focus on politicians. Instead, they cultivate relationships with people who own property, run cash-heavy businesses, or offer useful services. Tattoo parlors, tow yards, and auto shops often become informal support hubs, sometimes owned by members, sometimes simply aligned with them. Visibility becomes a weapon. Members ride in formation, appear at charity events, or host neighborhood barbecues. From the outside, they might appear to be nothing more than a brotherhood of motorcycle enthusiasts. But behind that public image lies a darker truth. Drug distribution, illegal arms sales, protection rackets, all tightly organized and expertly concealed. Control is maintained through fear. Businesses unwilling to comply might suffer vandalism. Residents who complain could face harassment or worse. Most quickly learn that calling the police is useless or dangerous. Either their complaints are ignored or word gets back to the club. The Hells Angels also operate through satellite groups known as support clubs. These smaller organizations carry out low-level crimes, track potential threats, and offer backup when needed. This layered approach keeps top leaders insulated from direct exposure. Over time, their presence becomes permanent, not because they're welcome, but because no one dares to oppose them. Police presence becomes hesitant. Crime goes unreported. Local businesses adjust to survive. Slowly, the laws of the land are replaced by the rules of the club. And yet, they didn't need to fire a single shot. The threat was enough. For decades, authorities were stuck reacting to crimes after they happened. That changed with a bold new strategy: infiltrating the club from the inside. One of the most famous examples is Operation Black Biscuit. In this early 2000s ATF sting, Agent J. Dobbins adopted a fake identity as an arms trafficker and spent more than 2 years integrating into the Hells Angels Arizona chapter. It took a tremendous psychological toll. Dobbins had to fake assaults, stage crimes, and convince real criminals he had killed someone, all while recording conversations and deceiving everyone around him. But his efforts paid off. Operation Black Biscuit revealed the club's inner workings like never before. Planning sessions, internal hierarchy, and covert criminal strategies were documented in detail. Dozens were arrested, and federal prosecutors finally had the tools to pursue long overdue convictions. Even so, the personal cost was severe. Dobbins lived under federal protection for years after the operation ended, knowing that retaliation from the club was always a possibility. Other operations across the country followed, requiring agents to risk everything to infiltrate the Hells Angels. Still, even with all this evidence, convictions remained difficult. The club used coded communication, strict loyalty pledges, and decentralized structures that made it nearly impossible to cripple the organization entirely. Every time a chapter was dismantled, another emerged to take its place. Still, these operations showed that the Hells Angels were not invincible. With patience, coordination, and courage, law enforcement could damage even the most fortified criminal organizations. But something else happened too. Ordinary citizens began to fight back. The story of towns like Fontana, Barstow, and Bass Lake shows how fragile law and order can be. When fear takes over where authority should be, power shifts from government to gang. And that shift doesn't require laws to be rewritten or votes to be cast. It just requires silence. Yet not every town surrendered. In courtrooms across the country, prosecutors continue to pursue justice. In neighborhoods, residents are organizing, refusing to be silent any longer. And in federal agencies, brave men and women are still going undercover, risking everything to stop these criminal empires. The question that remains is chilling. Could it happen again? For every community that stood up and fought back, there are others where fear still rules, where engines echo like warnings, and where people turn their eyes away rather than speak up. The Hells Angels have shown America that control doesn't always come from a courthouse or a ballot box. Sometimes it's built on intimidation maintained through fear and allowed to grow in the silence of those too afraid to resist. And in that silence, the rumble of a motorcycle can still signal a power far greater than the law.